Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. The title is What Day Is It? Thinking Liturgically About Pandemic Youth Ministry. And I know for those who have went this last year, it really is one of those, what day is it? So we're excited that you're able to join us. Thanks for giving us an hour. If you've joined just recently, jump in on the chat, introduce yourself, where you're ministering at, the age group of youth that you work with. And also, if you haven't had a chance, I have a book available. I would love to send you. Nathan and Chris are both contributors to this book. Just reach out over chat. Let me know your email and that you're interested in the book, and I'll get that sent out to you. So I'm Aaron Brockmeyer. I serve with To Flourish, and I'm also the senior pastor of Faith Baptist in North Minneapolis. I've served at Faith since 2015. We are kind of a community-centered church, so it has been a very interesting ride this last year to walk through the pandemic here. So I'm excited to be engaged in this and to learn from this. Made to Flourish is a national organization. If you're not familiar with it, we're a pastors network. We are seeking to help pastors to integrate faith, work, and economic wisdom for the flourishing of their communities. We are a network that seeks to develop pastors primarily. We believe that when pastors are flourishing, when they grow in their understanding between faith, work, and economic wisdom, when they model healthy practices of work and rest, when they experience deep relationships with other pastors and congregational members and leaders, then those pastors are flourishing. And we believe that then those pastors can lead flourishing churches, churches who have corporate worship that lead individuals to worship God in every part of their life, that they lead churches that have discipleship pathways that equip congregational members to serve in every sector of society, and the work of the congregation is known, affirmed, and celebrated. And we believe that then those flourishing churches are able to impact their communities so that their communities are flourishing, that they steward well the resources of their community with economic wisdoms and initiatives that create and sustain opportunities to build capacity for all, and that there's vibrant partnerships with other churches and organizations in the community. So we are, again, national network. Nathan Miller, who's on the call, I'll have him introduce himself just in a moment, and I are the Twin Cities City Network leaders. And we seek to be able to convene events like this to connect pastors and churches with resources. We seek to lead groups that grow deeper in their understanding of faith, work, and economic wisdom. I also wanted to let you know that coming up, we have another Zoom learning opportunity. It'll be Thursday, April 29th from noon to 1 p.m. We're partnering with Thrivent to begin to have a time with Tom Nelson, pastoring towards a biblical view of wealth. The opportunity of wealth to create good, the issues with wealth where there can be a cause for injustice. So Tom will be joining us to talk on that. And we have a neat treat available because we're partnering with Thrivent. We are providing lunch virtually for everybody who registers. So you get a Uber Eats coupon that's good for a couple hours after you register for that day, and you can order a meal to join us for this virtual lunch meeting with Tom Nelson. So information, I'll follow up with information on how to register. You can find that if you're connected with the network. So if you haven't connected with us yet, really encourage you to sign up and be involved with that. Again, I'm excited to host this opportunity to engage with the work of youth. The two individuals that will be engaging are Neal and Nathan Miller. Both are contributors to this book called Fertile Ground, Faith and Work for Youth Pastors. We have this available. Let me know if you'd like a copy, and I will get that to you. Just give me your email, and I'll follow up for your mailing address and get that into your hands. With that, I'd like to introduce Nathan Miller, or have Nathan Miller introduce himself, and then he'll introduce our presenter today, Chris. So Nathan is a City Network leader along with me, and he serves as a pastor at Friendship south of the cities, and I'll let him introduce himself from there.
Great, thank you, Aaron. As Aaron said, I'm Nathan Miller, and I primarily work as the family ministry pastor at Friendship Church, which we have 2 campuses, and one in Prior Lake and one in Shakopee. And I'm currently at the Prior Lake campus this morning and excited to be with you. I work with kind of birth through college at our 2 campuses, so enjoy kind of a range of ages that we're serving. But in the context of working with Aaron and Made to Flourish, you end up meeting some phenomenal people. That's one of the best perks of being a part of this network, is interacting with people across the country who are trying to do their best within ministry settings to towards whole life discipleship. And one of the guys I met 8 years ago was Neal, and we've been laboring together, trying to help each other, sharpen each other, to figure out how best do we serve students when it comes to whole life discipleship, not only on Wednesday nights or Sundays or whenever you meet, but also the whole of a student's life. How do we invest in them and create pathways of formation that are healthy for students? And so we've been wrestling with these things, and years into this conversation, we convened other youth leaders and through Made to Flourish, and thought, we should put our heads together and try to create a resource to further this conversation. And so the book is the result of a lot of those conversations. And again, we're inviting you all into this same think tank of how do we help students and serve students well, given the challenges that we currently face, both culturally and certainly now with this pandemic. And so glad you could be a part of this call. Want to just introduce Chris. He, like I said, he works with Made to Flourish as a city network leader in Los Angeles. But his main play is that he works at Azusa Pacific University in their Center for Vocational Ministry. He directs the Youth Leadership Initiative within that center, and has been doing a great job doing that. Having served 12 years in the church as a youth and family pastor, he brings a wealth of church knowledge, and currently serving even in the academic realm of trying to equip the church, right at the heart of trying to figure these things out and equip the church to serve well. He's married, has 3 daughters, and again, is in LA. So sometimes it's jealous being on a Zoom call with him, knowing that the weather's a little different out there than it is here in the Midwest. But so glad Chris can be here, and would love to welcome Chris now to jump on and lead us in this great topic.
Awesome. Thanks, Nathan. Thanks, Aaron. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. I hope that this time is helpful, that it serves you well in the important mission that God has called you to. About 7 years ago, I was about 10 years into youth ministry. So I was at the same church for all 12 years. So at the time, I was kind of in this place of just sort of thinking through, like, what impact are we having? Like, if we think about, like, our call as a ministry is to help see kids transformed into the image of Christ rather than conform to the image of the world, like Romans 12 said. Like, therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Don't conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So this juxtaposition between conform to the image of the world or transform to the image of Christ, I was asking myself, am I seeing that? Is that the fruit? Like, if that's what people would visit my youth ministry, is that what they would say is happening? And in prayer and reflection, this image of a wave pool came to mind. There's a place called Raging Waters. It's like right by our church. It's a water park. It's not this picture, best picture I could find online. But this image came through of a wave pool. And it's this idea that, me as the youth pastor and my volunteers, we are treading water right at the face of that wave machine. And we are there. We have boogie boards, foam boards, we have cups, we have our hands. And we are working tirelessly, taking midnight text messages, pulling all-nighters, running trips, events, doing anything that we can as these waves of youth are coming out to reshape them, to help them see transformation to the image of Christ. And yet it just felt like this machine is continuing to conform them to the pattern of this world. It was this tension between, like, what if we actually could get into the machine and they were just transforming it into the image of Christ in the machine? That would be so much more helpful. But that prayer, that thought began to kind of introduce me to the works of James K.A. Smith. He originally wrote it up in desiring the kingdom, and then elaborated more in the you are what you love. We talked about the ideas of cultural liturgies, and Smith defines cultural liturgies as the daily rituals or practices that shape our habits and consequently our loves, affections, desires, and hungers. The language and framework of cultural liturgies helps us to recognize the powerfully formative effects of the practices, habits, and rituals we participate in every day. And for me, this thinking about cultural liturgies has been profound at helping me just see differently, to be able to think through, how do I reimagine individual and corporate spiritual disciplines to equip young people to be transformed to the image of Christ and not conform to the pattern of this world. And so I want us to first kind of wrap our heads around what's Smith talking about, and then kind of contextualize it in this current moment. In the midst of the pandemic, how might this help us to imagine a new praxis of ministry in this context? So sometimes it's helpful to break down those two words, liturgy and cultural, like cultural liturgy. So what is liturgy? It's literally just a construct of two Greek words meaning the people and work. So it's the work of the people. And it originally referred to all public work. It was not a sacred term. It was just a term that meant all work. But then over time, the English version of it began to use more narrowly for this to refer to church services, or specifically to the Eucharist, or even to the written documents that order the church services. I think even today we think of it as like, this is what happens when the church comes together. It's the sacred actions, practices, rituals that we participate in as the gathered church, with the belief, hope, and desire that these practices help us as a community be transformed towards Christ-likeness. So as we think about what are cultural liturgies, it's really just sort of trying to recapture both aspects of that word, the scope of the word of all public work of all people, all works, and then also the vision of formation that happens as we engage in practices. It's basically saying that it's not just that when we show up on Sunday and we are intentionally engaging spiritual practices that those form us, but actually everything all the time is forming us. And Smith says, cultural liturgies are at the end of the day are rival liturgies. They're rival to the liturgy of the gospel, and they contain this malformed story of the good life. And then embedded in the various rituals and pictures and symbols are these implicit messages of this is what you should love as ultimate, or in other words, like that this is what becomes an idol. It's replacing God's role. And if you love this thing as ultimate, you will gain access to this good life. I think sometimes illustrations are better than definitions. Smith in his book talks more about the liturgy of the mall. And he says, just simply by participating in the liturgy of the mall, like we will become more individualistic and more materialistic. It is a liturgical experience. As he talks about, don't just think of this, oh, this is just a secular building. It's benign. We walk into this building and we just pay money and we get things and that's it. But it's actually a religious experience. Like the mall is a temple. And as we enter the temple, we process through the foyer and down the hall, and then we begin to see even competing stories about the good life, right? You see the nutrition stories, like, if you were just a little bit healthier, you'd lose a little bit more weight, and then you would truly be happy. And as long as you just buy these things, that will happen, and you will have access to the good life. Or, maybe you'd be a little bit more comfortable in your own skin. Like if you just bought these clothes, you'd be just a little bit more confident. And if you're a little bit more confident, maybe you'd get this better job, and then you'd have a little bit more money, and then you'd have access to this good life. And he really just kind of unpacks that liturgy of the mall. And so for me, as I thought about youth ministry and the places that youth live, whether it's the liturgy of home, the liturgy of the drive to school, the liturgy of the walk to school, the bus ride to school, the liturgy of math class, the liturgy of sports. For me, one that I ended up kind of writing about in the book was like kind of the liturgy of Instagram. Just thinking about the idea that like that is a liturgical experience, right? As we scroll through the various images, these images immediately portray pictures, stories of the good life, right? I think of the bucket list family is one of the handles on Instagram, and it's like he was a tech entrepreneur who had this great idea and made millions and never has to work a day in his life, and so they just are spending their millions of dollars with his family collecting experiences for as long as he shall live. to be honest, that sounds like a pretty good story. Like if that was my story, I wouldn't be opposed to it. At the same time, I think the gospel story challenges me in it. But in that, as you scroll, depending on which pictures we're drawn to, because there's also the, fame is more important than your life. So, walking on the beam of this high rise in downtown, dangling off by one hand, jumping with your feet out over it and then jumping back. Being famous is worth risking your life for, right? There's these stories that our young people are saying that this is the good life. And if I just simply do these things, I will have access to them. But there's also just even probably some level of, I can't do that. Or they have 10,000 likes, or they have 500,000 views, and I have 3. And it's just my mom and my 2 closest friends. And there begins this malformation of, like, I don't measure up. There's actually a metric in Instagram to say, where do you fall in actually having access to this good life? And so for me, it's just become this lens to begin to look through as I think about the young people that are entrusted to my care of what are the rival liturgies? What's the story of the good life according to their family? What's the story of the good life in their school, in their friends, in social media? And what are just the embedded rituals? It's not necessarily that people are explicit of saying, this is the good life and this is what you need to do. Sometimes I think the temptation as parents may be to do that. This is what I want for your life. But there's also just all these implicit things, the subtle comments, the little things that reinforce, this is what you need to do to make me happy and for me to define you as successful. And what are all those competing messages? And how do we as youth pastors walk that journey with them and unpack it? Because why do they matter? Like, why do cultural liturgies matter for youth ministry? Smith says, in short, we unconsciously learn to love rival kingdoms because we don't realize we're participating in rival liturgies, right? So much of focus in youth ministry, like from sticky faith and growing young, is like, let's just get them to church. Can we get them to stick in the church? Because we believe that once they're there, they will engage our liturgy and faith will be formed. But what happens when they participate in the liturgy of their school 30 times more in a week than they participate in the liturgy of church? Which liturgy, by sheer math, will be more effective? So how do we begin to think about that and imagine engaging that? So even it kind of takes it to the next level to see that, like, a lot of our modern discipleship practices, at least in the Western church, are kind of rooted in like Descartes, this idea that like, I think, therefore I am, and it's a very like rational thing. Like if I just download this information, then they will begin acting in this way. It's how our education system works as well. And I think even more so in Zoom culture, like even in this moment right now, it's kind of a Gnostic experience, right? We're not eating lunch together and giving each other a hug or a high five. We're not seeing each other. It's at some level a transmission of information. And in that we kind of get focused on orthodoxy, right beliefs, and hoping that translates immediately to orthopraxy, right actions. And he begins to say, like, what if instead of starting with the assumption that human beings are thinking things, we started with the conviction that human beings are first and foremost lovers? What if you are defined not by what you know, but by what you desire? What if the center and the seat of the human person is found not in the heady regions of the intellect, but in the gut level regions of the heart? How would that change our approach to discipleship and Christian formation? And he begins to say, like, we need to begin to realize the ways in which the things that we love are formed by the things that we do. Like, I go to the mall and I shop, or I go to Amazon and I shop, and it cultivates a certain kind of love. And from that love, I begin to believe certain things that if it's going to arrive longer than 2 days, I really need to question whether it's worth it. That's what Amazon Prime has shaped me to believe. If I want it, I'd rather need to be here today at Target or in 2 days at Amazon. But I begin to become more individualistic, materialistic. And so he begins to say, how do we begin to imagine the cultural liturgies that our young people are participating in, and how are the actions they take forming what they love and forming what they believe? And then how does the Christian liturgy, how does the Christian gospel speak into that in powerfully transformative ways? And he begins to say, in short, if you are what you love, and love is a habit, then discipleship is a rehabituation of our loves. This means that discipleship is more a matter of reformation than of acquiring information. Okay. I think the real question why we're here today. So why do cultural leaders matter for youth ministry in the time of COVID-19? There's a guy I follow. He writes a note to his kids on a napkin every day, puts in their lunch, but he also posts it on Instagram. And he posted this picture. He said, "I forget, is today a full day, half day, e-learning day, teacher's work day, holiday, weather day, or just Wednesday?" I think we all can kind of relate to this idea of like, what day is it? So we have 3 girls that are 6, 5, and 3. And about 2 months into the pandemic, my older 2 would kind of play this pop quiz game with my wife and I and say, "Mommy, happy Wednesday." Most of the time it wasn't Wednesday. It was just this like pop quiz. Does mom and dad actually know what day it is today? And so I think as we think about in this time, I believe that it's the thinking liturgically, like cultural liturgies about pandemic high school, enables us to see and name the pain and malformation of the lived experience of our students, enabling us to cultivate an imagination for new individual and corporate formation practices. I think work for everyone is hard right now. I've had this image that it feels like my work is like building sandcastles. Like I work really hard, I'm out in the sun, I do all those things, but there's going to be another wave, and the wave will wipe this out, and I'll have to rebuild it again. And so I know as youth workers, it's hard to keep cultivating imagination. So I know that even when I say that, it's very like, oh, it's simple. Okay, it sounds so neat and pie in the sky, Pollyanna-ish to say it this way. But I want to kind of go there for a little bit. Let's think about the cultural liturgy of pandemic high school right now. Like, let's think about a couple ideas that put this moment in context, and then just see how the Spirit leads us in terms of imagination, creativity, community. So the first thing I want to think is about, like, this is like the greatest disruption to the experience of high school in my lifetime. Thomas Hines says that at the turn of the 20th century, and in 1900, there were more teenagers working in coal mines than were in high school. Think about that. At the turn of the 20th century, more teenagers were working in coal mines than were in high school. By 1940, about 50% of American adults had a high school diploma. But probably for every one of us on the call, high school is just normative, right? Like everyone goes to high school. If you're a teenager and you're not in high school, it's like, what's going on? What happened that you're not in high school? And even like the high school calendar is probably the most universal cultural calendar that we have. I had this rhythm as a youth pastor where every time I was doing annual planning of when's summer camp, when's VBS, when's the service trip, when are we doing spring break, I had to download the calendars from all the different school districts because we have all these different start days and times. And so it was like, when are people starting in school? When are they stopping in school? Like the high school calendar shapes so much of our cultural thing. Like we can't go on summer vacation until these things are done. And yet COVID disrupted all of that. Like this moment is the greatest disruption in our shared cultural calendar in my lifetime, probably in all of our lifetimes. And I think it's just the problems and the paradox of screen time. So we have all this research coming out from psychologists about like screen time is not healthy. I get asked by our Kaiser pediatrician every time, are you keeping your child to between 1 and 2 hours of screen time on a daily basis, right? Which there's a whole bunch of funny tweets of like, I didn't realize we were supposed to be monitoring for screen time. But not only is it like, okay, so our students have been in these screens for school, which is resulting in all sorts of things, but then we can't get together for youth group, but we still want them to be formed in Christ, so we need to put them on the screen, but then they're not with their friends all day long, so they're longing for community. They just are like, have this insatiable appetite to connect with friends. And so what are the options? More screen time. And so it's either that we don't have education or spiritual access to the local congregation, or I don't have community, or I'm on a screen. I think it's also interesting as we think about Gen Z or iGen, whichever term you prefer, that the children of the Great Recession are the teenagers of COVID-19. Jean Twenge in her book, iGen, talks about how much the Great Recession was formative for Gen Z in terms of just growing up as children with parents financially strapped, all this news and the stress they took on, that they They're not looking to be millennials. I'm in like the older millennial part of that generation. We tend to be typified as like, I'm not going to take a job to just go work for corporate America. I want a job with purpose. I want a job that lets me be me and make an impact in the world. And Gen Z is a little bit, not to oversimplify, but is, I want a job that's going to pay me. I have artistic skills and it's going to be a hobby. I want career counseling to get if I need to go to college, I want a job that's going to pay because this financial insecurity. And so the children of the Great Recession are now the high school students of COVID-19. To me, that just seems like that. I don't understand all the impact there, but that seems to me something to pay attention to. In terms of like rites of passage, our culture doesn't offer a ton, but 16, getting your license, going to prom, high school graduation, these are the things that we offer them as rites of passage. And yet the DMV is closed. You can't go take your test. Prom is canceled. Graduation is either virtual or just simply canceled. I was hearing from young people that were connecting to us at APU about just, it's just another thing that's canceled. It's just another thing that's canceled. I know FOMO is an outdated term, but this idea of fear of missing out, I think it used to be that like, I'm stuck at home because I can blame mom or dad or my situation. And I see people doing these things and I'm missing out on what my friends are doing. But now we actually have like generational FOMO. Like I can't go do those things. I just have to keep being stuck in my space. And then what are they looking at when they're stuck? They just have access to media. And just it's been a very pervasive year of toxic media, looking at the election cycle, racial injustices. So then what are some things that we begin to see? And these are just like an initial list. I put the ellipses. I know that this room could add lots to this list, but this loneliness and isolation, rising anxiety and depression, Zoom fatigue, having to rewrite how to just hang out and foster community. It's this, can I high five you? Do you hug? Oh, 6 feet. Okay, I'm not sure how we do this anymore. They're getting less sleep and worse sleep just from being on screens all day. Their mind's not ready to shut off. There's this vicarious trauma, like I'm watching all this media and I'm hurting for that person. And I don't know how to sort that out. I don't even know how to name that. And so I'm just collecting grief more and more and more. And then there just becomes this like meaninglessness, like this growing nihilism, like, why does it matter? It's just another Zoom meeting. It's just another two-dimensional experience with people. So how might we think of a way forward? This is gonna be the last slide. I think we're gonna open up for some dialogue after that. And I meant this more to be like this isn't a checklist. This isn't like, I would be doing all these things. This is like, how might we reimagine discipleship practices? There's some terrible ideas in here, ideas that will not fit with where you're at. This is more of a could an idea you radically change and take it from there. But one just like a liturgical audit, like when we're together in small groups, would you actually begin to help people think through, like asking questions of, all right, let's talk through our week. Okay. In that week, okay, you're talking a lot about your sports team right now. Okay. Well, like according to your coach, like what's the good life? Or there's better ways to say it, but getting at the, like, in what ways is that community telling you a story of the good life, and what do they expect upon you in order to be able to have access to that? And how do we begin to help them unpack it? Simple prayers are like these ideas of these 3-sentence prayers that, like, in this moment, this is when I know that I am tempted or I am broken, and I need a prayer that I've already memorized. It's like an honest confession of this is where I'm at, a Christocentric reframing of this situation, and then an ask for help. Prayers of examine, just beginning to like, okay, every day when I log out of Zoom High School, I simply answer these 3 questions to help me process through this experience. Digital detox, how much can we get them off of screens? Solitude retreats in nature. I even think that once we are back together, to the degree that you are allowed to, circling up and holding hands to pray. We have such little contact, but even the simple thing of holding hands in my faith community, how much can that help? I think it is a time, as much as play has been rewritten, Nathan and I were talking the other day about how like the top 10 youth group games do not work in COVID. Like they are not COVID friendly. They require being closer than 6 feet. And so but at the same time, how do we not just cancel play? How do we, as a community of youth workers, play with them? Next one is just, how do we learn about anxiety and depression? I all the time found myself in this situation where I'm facing an issue and I'm just overwhelmed. I don't understand what this is. Like, I don't know about cutting or stealing parents' pills or beginning to drink. And I would always try to look for resources to help me in those spaces. I sent Nathan and Aaron an ebook that we wrote at APU about the current kind of situation with anxiety and depression. Happy to share that along with the book. So I think we have to reimagine practices of hospitality. Before it was easy, Little Caesars, put them out there. And kids gather around, just plant yourself next to the pizza boxes and we're going to hang out and talk. But now they're starting to see people who have like red, yellow, and green wristbands, like where they're at a thing and it's like, everyone who's wearing green, give me a hug, hold my hand, sit next to me. I'm craving contact. Yellow is like, we can talk and it doesn't have to be 6 feet, but maybe don't touch me. And red is the like, I expect you to be as restrictive as California. Like, I want you to be as shut down and as distant as California. I think just a couple more things. I think teaching students to lament, like the actual practice of being able to name, this is what it feels like. This is where I'm at. And an honest cry that's unfiltered to say to God, this is what my life feels like. I think also having conversation with whoever our leadership is about how do we write a new scoreboard for ministry, right? I think each church tends to have this is what we expect the youth pastor to do. And like reality has completely changed. And yet I think a lot of us are still held to the standard of the old way. And so how do we, with the permission to buy in to help lead a change process with leadership, get permission to say, I need to do this differently and I need to be held accountable differently. I need some permission to experiment, to go after what's really going on because of these cultural liturgies, not just simply business as usual. And I think in terms of like this idea of meaninglessness, like inviting students to co-create with us. Like I've wondered about like, what if, I think youth are better at having community online than adults are. What if young people were actually invited to help co-create community experiences for adults in the congregation? Like they have the agencies, like, you do this better than us. This isn't just like a simple service project, like go stack the chairs. We need you because you know something we don't know, and we think you can help us do it better. So again, this is just a how might we, things that could happen, hopefully to generate ideas, generate conversation. So I think we're gonna open up to some conversation. Nathan, this all kind of happened, I think, because of you and your own journey. I don't know if you would want to add some thoughts and then kind of take us into Q&A.
Sure, Chris. Thanks for these thoughts. And I would encourage a number of his concepts are drawn from the resource that Aaron mentioned, and so we'd love to have everyone have a copy to be able to further dialogue. So just email in the chat or include your email in the chat so we can make sure to get that book to you. But yeah, to Chris's point, the invitation in our final minutes is to begin asking some questions. What stirred in you some thoughts regarding what Chris shared? I would say here in the Midwest, and it's much different than what he's been experiencing or what you, Chris, have been experiencing in California. And there's regional differences as we've been navigating this. And even within the Twin Cities area more broadly, or even Midwest down to Iowa, churches have been attempting different ways to get at how do we love students well during this unprecedented time. And I would give a personal reflection on how it's looked here at Friendship Church. One of the challenges has been finding this balance between in-person and digital. And I'd be curious if other people have found some solutions to this, but we've discovered that as we did all digital, there's an immediate sort of something's better than nothing. But as we've moved into this more of a hybrid, as some physical has been allowed, we keep questioning the effectiveness. And in some ways, you only have a certain bandwidth to make both realms excellent. And so some people have completely left the digital to just serve the in-person. and there's this horrible feeling of like not caring for those certain sheep and it's the vulnerable sheep that are in many ways unable to receive the same kind of discipleship experience because of family health concerns or fears. And so a lot of the fears and damaging effects that Chris noted are the very demographic that many of us are shifting away from serving as we try to engage the in-person, because we do see that it's more effective. So finding that balance of caring for both realms of our congregation, I think for me has been really soul searching and frustrating. We want to honor well. I heard recently a previous church that I served at, and some of you are on the call from that previous church, have found ways of engaging, to Chris's last point, ways of engaging in new social spheres. Discord was the example I heard, where a youth group starts this online community kind of led by students or generated by students in ways that weren't really happening when it was pre-COVID. So I wonder how this might be opening up new avenues of community and relationship. I'd be curious to hear if there's been any aha moments that any of you have had of new developments that might hold promise for, even, Lord willing, once this pandemic, once we move to a healthier place, that you would continue to look to, because you've seen its effectiveness that's been generated, or the genesis has been found in the midst of this. So I'd love to hear if there's questions from the group, maybe clarification from anything Chris has shared, but would love to open it up for some Q&A. Would just invite you to unmute yourself, introduce who it is that's talking, so we kind of get that sense of who you are, where you're serving, and then ask a question of the group. You can also type in questions if it's easier that way to kind of formulate it, but would love to invite in some conversation.
I have one, Chris. This is something I've been dealing with each one of my children, and I think it's a little bit more common out there. You're talking about being formed, and how do you stop, or what are some suggestions that you've seen for kind of like, there's like a black hole attempt or a black hole formation, like Instagram. You can just keep on, you get stuck in this. Like, we let our daughter use my wife's Instagram here and there, and the first few times she looks at it, it's great. But then after like 10 minutes, she's like going into the unknown. And just the same thing with my boys were reading on the Kindle, and like they were doing the Kindle loan or library, and it was really good stuff. And then they finished that, and then they just wanted more, and all of a sudden they're pushing boundaries. Or the digital, oh, I have schoolwork. Well, then I'm texting friends, and then I'm schoolwork and texting, and like they get stuck almost. And as a parent, I don't know how to help them. And even for like as a pastor, how do we help people to get out of those? I mean, it's the Netflix, it's one after another. You just get in this liturgical cycle.
Yeah, when Netflix asks, "Are you still watching?" it does feel kind of like they're judging you just a little bit. Like, really, you're still watching TV? Clearly, you must have walked away. So I'm not an expert on like digital wellness and that kind of thing, but I do know of some people that I've gone to like learn from them. One is there's one named Angela Gurrell. She did her dissertation on kind of just the experience of social media, and from her research, she found that the two primary emotions that teenagers have when they engage social media is joy and anxiety. So it's a weird mix of I go to it because I remember the things that bring me joy, and yet I grow increasingly anxious over time. So some of her stuff is helpful for just sort of begin to understand it, like that. Similarly, there's a guy named Andrew Zerski who wrote a book called Behind the Screen, and his kind of fundamental theory is that like teens forever turn technology social. So a lot of times we think that, is it the they can have phone in youth group, or we take the phone away. And yet for them to have the phone is access to community. So there's some statistic about, like, I forget the number, but that students will send 1,000 text messages in a day or something like that. Something that just sounds astronomical. But what's actually happening when they're texting a youth group, it's like, hey, how's it going? Good, how you doing? But it's their own way of just like, are we safe here? Like, is this okay? Like, are we good? Like, I'm only going to be here if you're going to be here. Let's say there's a number of things coming out that I find are helpful for learning about it, but at the same time, I think there is some level of setting boundaries in terms of just sort of like, and almost like having to make the commitment ahead of time, because if it just sort of is like they have unfettered access, like my daughter would watch TV all day long if I let her. And so as much as I feel guilty every time the pediatrician says like, oh, are you keeping screen time to less than 2 hours a day? To me, at least that is I know that what Kaiser is doing, they're setting a mental marker of like, this is how much it is. So I think learning how do young people view technology? It's access to community, helping them learn that like, when you get off of social media, how do you feel? Like, you're drawn to it because you remember the joy, but do you feel joy afterwards? And that's where I think even having a simple prayer for the end of Instagram, it's like, all right, every time you log out, you simply have a prayer of, I'm envious right now because I think my friends have a better life than me. God, you have created me to be who I am and live the life you call for me. God, help me to believe and want the life that you have for me. Something that's like, this is something that allows them to sort of like name it, bracket it, and then ask God for help to move on. I don't know if other people around the room have had their own ideas or solutions of how they've helped young people navigate sort of that spiral that can happen with media.
I would say there's a number of really good resources coming out on that very topic, and I'd highlight Tony Reinke has written 2 books that I've been really helped by. 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You, and Competing Spectacles, Treasuring Christ in the Media Age, are 2 books by Tony Reinke that I've been helped by. Andy Crouch has another helpful book as well. There's a number of resources out there, but I'd say I've been pleased by some of the books that have been coming out to help strategize methods.
Bryce Roskins, youth pastor in Iowa, and for a couple of years now, our church and our youth ministry has been kind of working on some of this ideas of the discipleship process. And of course, I'm kind of intrigued in the youth area. And I appreciate what you're saying about, things are changing and have been changing for a while now. You can't just offer a 101, 201, 301 class and then they're going to figure it out. So I'd be interested in kind of hearing a little bit more, flush out those ideas of how do we make this a process? Kind of the things you mentioned are like, these are things we can utilize within our youth ministries, our church environments. But how do you kind of get a steady course for students, taking them from unbeliever to, or just, to kind of how they are mature in their faith?
I remember there's a Bank of America commercial from like 20 years ago that they talked about that, like, we process 5 million checks a day. And so people always ask us like, oh, how do you even conceive of processing 5 million checks a day? And I said, we didn't. We just we figured out how to process one check correctly, and then we repeated it 5 million times. And I think sometimes from like the youth ministry that like I started in was kind of that Christendom era youth ministry where it's like, it's about revival and about calling them back. It's about buddy nights and invite your friend, and how do we get them back? Because of course this is a Christian nation. And I think people talk a lot more about designing for exile, or even I would say probably more exile sort of assumes we're going to return back to Christendom, that we probably need to be more prepared to like diaspora. Like, how do we, when we come together as the faith community, cultivate authentic faith in a way, not so much that is this big banner that we can call people back to, but that is more of a city on a hill that we live distinctly. But I think that's where I think we need to rethink our the scoreboard of our youth ministry and do it with leadership, because likely senior pastors have a little bit more of that Christendom air. Well, this is how I did youth ministry back when I started 40 years ago. And so it just simply was rallies, big your friend night, those kind of things, 101, 201, 301. But it is more that how do we go small? How do we get into the weeds of how young people are being formed? See them not as an object to be fixed, but more as a young person. They are adult in training that I'm going to live life with. And even this is where I also even go to like John of the Cross. He had this prayer of like, God, I'm praying for revolution, but may that revolution begin with me. So I think it begins with, how do I cultivate in myself faith? How then do I help parents develop their faith? And then in that, how do I live life with young people? And so I think there's some big macro reframing of what the primary task of youth ministry is to get us there. And then after that, it becomes a lot of contextualization. It becomes very much like, which city are you in? Who are your 12 disciples? Like, who are the 12 there? And how what's going to work in that situation? Do you have any follow up or with that, Bryce?
No, I think that's, great to hear. And I think, appreciate what you're saying there. I think this idea of mentorship's been around forever. And, and so it seems like it does naturally come back to that somewhat. I think, it does have to start with the buy-in of parents and even church leaders to offer, they've done hundreds of Bible studies. It's like, we don't need another Bible study, in a sense, like just go meet with this student and do some life. And so, sometimes that seems maybe too simple, but yet adults are still a little bit scared by that sometimes, especially in the digital age. They have no idea sometimes what's going on. So, but yeah, appreciate your thoughts.
Yeah, and so much of our culture like separates us by generation. Like we have significant generational segregation. It's weird for adults to hang out with kids, and yet I think the church is trying to live into that. I think in terms of some of the intentionality when we do get that mentorship, like Fuller Youth Institute talks about their 5-to-1. For every one kid, they need 5 adults actively involved. It might be a coach, parent, that sort of thing. We also found that there's the Search Institute. They're like a institute that's done some of the largest research on adolescence, and they have the 40 developmental assets. And it's the idea that like if a young person, the more assets they have cultivated in them, the more likely they are to turn out sort of like this life of meaning and purpose in their life. And so we looked as a youth group as, if this is true, which of these 40 is the church primarily called to cultivate? And then how do we cultivate that through small group mentorship, even building our curriculum around those different things. But if you look, the Search Institute, 40 developmental assets, it's a free PDF out there. And it became a lens for us of how do we even be intentional in this. And then as we're doing real good for these young people, parents wanted more of it.
Chris, and some others can jump in with a question if they need to, but one of the questions that I've been asked and that I'm hearing is like, are we going to end up all digital in our liturgies? Are we going to end up, should we actually just really push back and try to be as physical as possible? Like, I feel like there's, like at the start of it was like, all right, we can do this, it's all digital. And now after a year of this, I'm hearing this, like, we really probably should just try to, as much as possible, to get people back in physical presence. Like, where do you see us going? And like, how should we be intentional to shape the future of ministries in that digital physical?
It's a great question. And I wish I had a crystal ball to know what that looks like. But I think thinking about the idea of stewardship and stewarding what resources we have. So I think for me, I didn't work in a mega church, and I don't currently attend a mega church. But Saddleback Kids YouTube channel has been really helpful for me in like telling Bible stories to my children when we were doing family church at home. And so I think some churches, it might be like they're big enough. They actually, it might be worth them thinking about having a production part of their church that's putting stuff out there. But I think that's not the norm. I think it's something like 90% of churches in America are less than 200 people, maybe even less than 100 people. And so for them, it might be helping curate online resources that are helpful for accessing when our people are not gathered. So it's pastor as curator to these different resources, and then thinking through what can we alone do when we're together. The incarnation matters. It wasn't something enough for God to think about sacrificing himself for us. He had to come in body to die for us, to forgive our sins. And so I think there was always going to be an incarnational nature to the church. There ought to be. And so my bias is to lean as much into the incarnational ministry as possible, while also realizing that in all of life, like my students, when they were like, oh, they came to me and they had the question about dating relationships. And then in the conversation, they grew up in the church, were really close or whatever. And they're like, yeah, last week I was Googling blah, blah, blah. I was like, so you went to Google for advice about this before you went to me. So I think there's a level of like naming the reality of how much accessibility matters. And so how do we curate where and make it as accessible as possible in the digital form, while also leaning into incarnational ministry.
Yeah, we probably have time for maybe one more question. If someone else hasn't asked one, perhaps we'd love to invite you to ask another question. And while you're thinking, I was going to mention recently reading a book called Deep Discipleship by J.T. English, and he talks about the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of small groups for discipleship. And I think, and he actually references James K. Smith, who Chris mentioned with his cultural liturgies, and he talks about there's certain spaces in church that are most effective for learning, and there's certain spaces that are most effective for community. And sometimes trying to accomplish both at the same time can be problematic. And so if we are trying to get out of a learning space lots of community, or vice versa, we might be up a hill or up a creek without a paddle, so to speak. And so he emphasizes the need to dial into the environments that we're creating in ways that actually get the results that we're wanting to get. So even to Bryce's point, or your question there, Bryce, of formation and discipleship, certain environments are more conducive to certain end results. And so a curiosity I have is ways in which the spaces that we're able to have online can't necessarily accomplish some of the outcomes that we'd like to have. And so in what way can we use them for their designated effectiveness, while recognizing other spaces might be critical for the other needs that we might have? Just a comment. But any other question?
I was just curious if, in your guys' experience, have you seen, high school, middle school students own these cultural liturgies, or is it us telling them you have these?
Yeah, from my experience, that term, that concept is it's more of a lens through which I see their lived reality. So in conversation, I'm not using the word cultural liturgy. So let me share. If you don't mind, I'll share my screen real quick. But like, this is like a more formal way to do it, like a liturgical audit. But to the degree that you can be doing that intentionally, but like inconspicuously, but like how do people in my life define success for me, right? Are your parents saying you have to be a doctor, a lawyer, or this to have a life that matters? Like, how do people define success for you? Trying to get at like, what are the competing stories of the good life in their life? So these are the things that I have on my radar to think about. And then it's always about, yeah, how do you contextual it down to a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old, a 17-year-old? I don't think I've ever actually used the language of cultural liturgy explicitly, maybe not even with my volunteers, but more in this idea, like how do we get it, how their lived experiences is shaping this. So.
That's phenomenal. Thank you so much, Chris, for this language, these hooks to hopefully hang some of the discipleship efforts that we're doing on, and for continuing this conversation. Would love for you to reach out to us, for us to put you into more contact, both with these tools and resources and further discussion. But Aaron, if you want to close us, that'd be great.
I just really appreciate everybody taking an hour. I know this is typical of the pandemic, COVID. Lots of different options out there to watch and to engage in, and so we appreciate your time. I also appreciate each and every one of you pouring into youth. I have 3 children and a senior pastor and in North Minneapolis, and I believe truly that the youth are the church, and it's unbelievably difficult nowadays, and yet it's so rewarding. So thank you, each one of you, for your time and effort. Again, Nate and I would love to bless you in your work. So reach out. I'll send a follow-up email. Reach out about. We'll send you a book. Nathan's got a great chapter on the youth pastor as a theologian, talking about the creation, fall, redemption, and restoration narrative, shaping and forming how you speak, teach, and disciple the youth, and how each aspect of that narrative is so important for the youth to understand, to be able to know, and to live out. We also host a number of different opportunities like this. We want to resource you. This is about helping you flourish in your ministry. So please be engaged with the network. We have a time with Tom Nelson coming up. If you didn't see that earlier, that is in April. It's online from noon to 1, and we are providing lunch though. So you get to eat with us virtually. You get an Uber Eats coupon, good for a couple hours right around that time, so you can order the meal of your choice and join us to engage. So that's Thursday, April 29th. We'll continue to have other opportunities come up, and I'll send you a follow-up email. So again, thank you so much for your time, your energy, your ministry. Thank you, Chris and Nathan, for leading us. And let me just close with a prayer. Lord, you are the God who has created us, and through your Holy Spirit and the work of Jesus Christ, you are the God who forms us. Lord, we pray that not only that we would be intentional in our formation, so that our hearts and minds are centered upon you, but that our work would be intentional, so that we are able to form the youth, the children, the individuals that you've given us to shepherd, to care for. Help us to see what is shaping and forming each one of us and those we work with, Lord. So we pray that our work would bring you great glory. Lord, we pray that you'd bless our work and give us favor. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.